Well, good morning. It's good to see you guys. I'd love it if you open a Bible with me at this time to Matthew chapter 5. We're looking at verses 31 through 37 together this morning in Matthew chapter 5. And as you're opening up your Bibles there, I'm curious this morning how many of you love doing things that you don't feel like doing? Anybody love doing what you don't feel like doing? Anybody? Any psychos in the room? Right? No? New Year's are all sane people. Right? None of us want to do things we don't feel like doing. That's like the weirdest question in some ways. But it creates a problem in our lives because there are things we should do that we don't want to do. And that is what we often call faithfulness. It's being faithful to do the things that we don't want to do even when we don't feel like it. And when we don't feel like it, that's when we want to bow out. That's when we want to bow out. And I think even is summarized a little bit or illustrated in this passage we're about to read. This is why we value expositional preaching here at Pathway, because it means that we'll go through sections of Scripture that maybe we normally wouldn't like wag our tails and be really excited about preaching. And this is one of those passages. It can be a very difficult and painful passage for people. But we trust that God's word is always good for us. It's always good for us. And so read along with me Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount, beginning in verse 31. What does he say? It was also said, whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. But I say to you that everyone who divorces his wife, except on the ground of sexual immorality, makes her commit adultery. And whoever marries a divorced woman commits adultery. Again, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. But I say to you, do not take an oath at all, either by heaven, for it is the throne of God, or by earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great king. And do not take an oath by your head, for you cannot make one hair white or black. Let what you say be simply yes or no. Anything more than this comes from evil. Today's passage, like I said, it's all about faithfulness and doing things that we don't often feel great about doing in the moment. It's about follow through, right? When it's easier, way easier to give up. Just recently, I just finished Alfred Lansing's biographical sketch of Ernest Shackleton and his voyage in 1914 with 28 men down to Antarctica. You guys know the story? It's an amazing story. I don't have time to tell it to you, but they were set out to be the first people to sail from South Georgia Island to Antarctica and make it all the way across. And their ship got stuck in these ice floes. And their ship broke apart, and they lived on these ice floes for a year. And it was freezing. It was dark. They just ate blubber, and just the life sounded miserable to me. They had to do some gnarly things. And I remember thinking the whole time, man, I would just give up. Like, I would just be like, all right, this is it. This is how I go. But they didn't give up. They took their little lifeboats, essentially, and once the ice melted enough, they sailed off again to Elephant Island, and then 5 of them sailed over to South Georgia, where they set off from the beginning, 650 nautical miles across the Drake Passage, which is just like a gnarly passage. And they made it, 5 of them. And then they had to hike over this mountain range that no one had ever made it across before, in the middle of the night. I mean, it's just an incredible story. I'll admit it got a little boring in the middle. There was a lot of like ship talk. I had to like keep researching what is a hull and all these things that I don't know anything about. But it really is like, it was an exhilarating story. And if for no other reason, it was exhilarating because it just forced me to come face to face with this sense of, man, I live a pretty like cushy life. I don't just eat blubber all day and things like that. I mean, these men suffered, and granted, they willingly suffered for 2 years, right? They set their minds to endure together, and every single one of them survived because they did it together. They faithfully endured, and I think it's pretty cool that their ship was called the Endurance, and they endured. And I think that made me kind of wonder and wrestle with how often in my life do I make decisions based upon ease and comfort. I want life to not carry with it much resistance at all. Right? When things are good, I'll keep going. When things get tough, maybe I'll reconsider. What are my other options? And I think that's really what this passage is getting at here this morning. Jesus' teaching is on divorce and deceit. Divorce and deceit. And he's really just talking about faithfulness. What I want you to see is Jesus talking about the good life, right? We've been talking about this. The good life is the life of righteousness. That's what we're calling it. But the good life, he's saying, is not looking for a way out, but looking for a way through. When things are going wrong, it's continuing on, right? It's figuring out what's a way through. The good life, you could simply say, is a faithful life. It's a faithful life. Jesus is actually addressing the third and fourth examples that he's begun to give starting back up in verse 21. If you'll remember and look up in your Bibles to verses 17 through 20, Jesus taught us that he did not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill the law, which is great news, right? Meaning that you and I are actually saved by God's grace alone, right? He's the only one who lived the law perfectly. And so that is where we find our salvation. It's trusting in him that he is the perfect one who died in my place on the cross for me, right? So I could be forgiven. But don't miss the fact that he ended by also saying, hey, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. And again, that's not to say you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. It's just that his righteousness actually did exceed, and it's given to you. But still, that doesn't mean that you and I now go, we can live however we want. So what he's been doing is unpacking this life of righteousness for us. And it's not an easy life, is it? It's not an easy life. And so here, he addresses divorce and our promises, our oaths, what we do with our words. And he's saying the faithful life is the good life. And I want to begin, too, just by acknowledging how incredibly personal that I recognize a passage like this is for us. I mean, we're not talking about just theological concepts and biblical ideas. We're talking about real life, real people's lives. And so I understand that this teaching this morning is going to intersect at probably some of the deepest hurts that some of you have in this room. And that's not past me. And so I want to actually begin by you just hearing very clearly from me, I need you to know this, that Jesus really is for you. He really is for you. He's not against you. His teaching is for you, and he is actually for you. And so this morning, maybe you're here and you've gone through a divorce, or maybe you're going through a divorce, or your parents went through a painful divorce. And so this kind of dusts up a lot of painful memories for you. Realize that in the eyes of God and in the eyes of our church, you don't walk around with a scarlet letter on your chest, like the big red D. That's not what the Bible teaches you. Right? There is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. That is the great hope of the gospel. There is not the unforgivable sin or anything like that. Right? You can find healing and hope in Christ. Everybody can. And so I just want to say that, but I also want to tell you that I hope that you and I will take Jesus' words to heart this morning, even though it's not an easy word, because we can trust him. We can trust him and know that if we take his words to heart, we really will live a life that you and I were meant to live. And so the first thing I want us to look at when it comes to this marriage and divorce section of verses 31 through 32, and we will spend the majority of our time here because it's a hairier section, I want you to see that Jesus is clearly teaching you, don't look for a way out, but a gracious way through marriage. When it comes to marriage, when it comes to your marriage, or if you're single, when it comes to your vision of marriage, don't just be living it out, looking for a way out. Jesus wants you to look for a way through, a gracious way through. Remember what he says in verse 31, it was also said, right? Remember, he's contrasting his teaching, his authoritative teaching as the Son of God, in contrast with the Pharisees' interpretation of what God's law taught. And so here he actually does quote something from Deuteronomy chapter 24. Whoever divorces his wife, let him give her a certificate of divorce. So back in this time, only a husband had the authority to give a certificate of divorce to their spouse. It wasn't the other way around. But we live in a day and time, which I propose is better, that both men or women can do that, right? And so this was what they could only do in their day, in their time. And so they were taught that if you're going to divorce your wife, that you had to give them a certificate of divorce. And they really took that and they ran with it. And the reason why, as Martin Lloyd-Jones points out, that they were doing things like this, why Moses is instructing this, is because marriage was sort of in a divorce, I guess, was kind of out of control. Right? It's pretty chaotic. People were divorcing each other for all sorts of things, and if the husband was mistreating the wife and divorcing her and not giving her a certificate of divorce, she's walking around just hopeless. No one will take her in. But if they give her a certificate of divorce, that's done in the presence of a couple of people, and she has a certificate going around saying, I can be remarried now. I can be remarried. It was actually done then for the protection of the wife, and often even for the children. And so Martin Lloyd-Jones points this out. I think it's really helpful that it was done in order to help these people and bring order to a chaotic culture around divorce. Sadly, this was still going on a lot during Jesus' day. It was a bit out of control. And so if we could fast forward a little bit to Matthew chapter 19, it should be free up here on the screen for you. We get Jesus' teaching in the same gospel on divorce. This is really important. The Pharisees go to Jesus a little bit later on and look at what they say to him. Is it lawful to divorce one's wife for any cause? That's a really good question. Have you ever wanted to ask Jesus that question? Have you ever wondered what Jesus thinks about divorce? Maybe you've actually thought about that personally. What does Jesus think about my divorce from 20 years ago or 10 years ago? What does Jesus think about the divorce that I just filed the papers for? What does Jesus think about my parents' divorce? Right? I mean, maybe you thought about maybe this weekend even, I don't know your life. Maybe you have a friend who's saying, hey, can we meet and talk? I'm thinking about leaving my spouse. And you're sitting there as a Christian friend just like, how do I help my friend? What should I say? What does Jesus think about divorce? What do I say to my friend? Right? So it's really interesting. They asked Jesus, is it lawful to divorce your wife for any reason at all? Right? That's a really good question. And look at Jesus' response in verses 4, 5, and 6. It really gets to the heart to help us understand what he's saying here in the Sermon on the Mount, okay? Follow me. What does he say? Well, let's not answer that question right away. Instead, can I tell you and remind you what marriage is? That's really what he says. Do you remember that in the beginning, it was God? It was God's idea. Marriage is God's idea, and he has joined two people together as one flesh. He's reminding them that's what marriage is. It's a one flesh union between two people, one husband and one wife. That's what it is. He's reminding them of that. That's all he simply says. It's a one flesh union. We talked about this, I think, in the fall when we went through Ephesians, earlier in the spring. Right? The picture actually is a head and a body joined together. That's really important joining, isn't it? Your head needs your body needs your head. I'm not a doctor, but I imagine that's the case. Right? That's the picture of one flesh union. So the husband's described as the head of the wife, who's the body in the New Testament. It's a one flesh union, right? So he just answers it, saying, what God has joined together, let no man separate. And so what do they say? Well, when Moses, taught us, why then did Moses command us to give a certificate of divorce and send her away? And do you see what they did? They turned an allowance under certain grounds into a command. Oh, someone was unfaithful, you're commanded to give them a certificate of divorce. And so they think they're righteous. They think they're doing this. Right? They're looking for a way out, right? Not a way through. And they're doing a really good job of giving out the certificates. That was the emphasis. Hey, as long as you're giving the certificate, that's what Moses told us to do. We're giving the certificates. Right? For all sorts of reasons, we're giving these certificates. And so that's why Jesus in verse 31 is addressing this. That's why he's addressing this. Right? They've changed what was not intended in the heart of God. Divorce, Jesus is basically saying, is not commanded. God never commands it. Right? God hates divorce. It's even against the design of what it actually is, but because of the hardness of people's hearts, meaning when one person in the marriage is so hard-hearted they won't repent, they won't humble themselves, they won't fight for a way through, sometimes it then becomes allowable. But it's a one-flesh union, and you have to understand that if you're ever going to understand why Jesus is so clear here. And so think about that. If it's a one-flesh union, I think that's why divorce is so painful, isn't it? Because if marriage is a one-flesh union, then divorce is an amputation, isn't it? And I don't say that just to sound intense or scary or something, but I do think that for the countless people I've sat down with over the years as a pastor, that seems to certainly describe everyone's painful experience with divorce. I've never had someone describe divorce to me like changing their outfit. I was wearing this outfit and now I'm wearing this outfit. It sounds like an amputation, doesn't it? It feels like an amputation. And so Jesus in verse 31 is saying, don't just focus on the certificate. You're missing the entire point. And this is also then why verse 32, he begins to give grounds for divorce, which I'll get to that in 1 second. But look at the last thing. He says, anyone who marries someone who is not rightfully free to leave a marriage and remarry, he says what? Is someone who's committing adultery. Why would it say that? Because in the eyes of God, you're still one flesh with another person, right? You didn't have biblical grounds for it. So Jesus' teaching here is quite difficult, I think, for many people, especially in our day and age, because how many of you feel like pretty safe to go out and start telling other people who aren't Christians in this world about your marital struggles, and you say, hey, what should I do? How many of you feel like they're going to tell you, hey, fight for your marriage? Hey, think about God's mercy in your life and be merciful. Oh, you should forgive. Be gracious. How many of you think you're going to get that response? Hey, find a way through. Not many people are going to tell you that, are they? Right? Not many people are going to tell you that. And I understand, guys, this is tricky. I mean, it would be very unwise for me as a pastor to stand up here and to make blanket statements. You should never get divorced under any circumstances. It would be impossible to make some blanket statement like that. I mean, if you're going through a really hard time in your marriage, there are legitimate reasons to divorce that Jesus will explain here. But if you're going to do that in community, do that with the care of a pastor or somebody walking with you in that process. I'm trying so hard to avoid taking the edge off this passage, to dull the blade of it. Because I think that's our tendency, is to go, well, what are the exceptions? But hear the heart of Jesus in what he's teaching us here. He is saying so clearly what marriage is, and in light of what it is, look for a way through it. Don't just look for a way out of it. Look for a way to be faithful, not just a way out. And so, with that said, though, Jesus does talk about biblical grounds for divorce, right? So just like in an amputation, sometimes amputations are necessary to save a life, right? Aren't they? Right? But when you have an amputation, that's always the last resort, isn't it? If you go to a doctor, they're going to try everything else, but the last resort would be to amputate something in order to save a life. I'm not a doctor, and I think I know that, right? The doctors in the room could check me later, okay? But I think the same is true, and so the Bible does give some grounds for divorce as a last resort. There's two places, and we could sum it up. Most pastors, most theologians sum it up with 3 A's. The biblical grounds for divorce would be adultery, abandonment, or abuse. Adultery, abandonment, or abuse. And there's really 3 texts in the New Testament that give us this paradigm. One of them is right here in the Sermon on the Mount. It's repeated again in Matthew 19 by Jesus on the grounds of sexual immorality. And the other one is from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. So really quickly, look at what Jesus says. The first grounds is sexual immorality or adultery, right? But his term is actually sexual immorality, which makes this really tricky, doesn't it? Because that's a very general term, and there are actually a lot of different things that would fit under Jesus' label here. And before we get any wild ideas, I think it's wise to look back up in the passage that was just preached 2 weeks ago by Adam, because what did Jesus teach us about lust? He says in verse 27, look there with me, you've heard it said, you shall not commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. So on a very real level, if you're taking Jesus' words to heart and what his vision of the good life is for you, then wouldn't you argue at some level that every single marriage would have biblical grounds for divorce? Because how many people in this room or how many marriages exist where there hasn't been one look of lustful intent? Right, we understand that lust isn't the same devastating consequence as full-out affair, but as we spoke before, lust is the acorn and the affair is the oak tree. Right? Jesus is getting at our hearts again. And so this is biblical grounds, but we must tread lightly because I think at some level, a lot of people are guilty here. And so I think that just overwhelmingly breeds a sense of we need each other's grace. We need each other's grace, right? And that grace will restore many marriages. I've seen it. Oh, I've seen it. But the second place we see is in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 15. And there, Paul writes, if an unbelieving spouse leaves a believing spouse, let them leave. A brother or sister is not bound in such cases. God has called you to live in peace. Basically, here, Paul is saying, if someone's abandoned the marriage, let them abandon it. That person's now free to remarry. Okay? The word is actually chorizo, which is a delicious meat, right? Which is interesting. I don't know, I'm not saying there's a connection, okay? But it's the word to separate or divide. It's the idea of a divorce, right? And so this is where a lot of people have included the idea of forced abandonment, right? Sure, a spouse might just leave another spouse, and that's included here in that verse. But there are instances where a spouse has acted in such an abusive way that they've essentially dissolved the marriage. They're so abusive to their own body, right? Because it's a one flesh union, and there needs to be an amputation. Right? Someone's being physically abused, or in extreme situations like an emotional type of abuse. And so there are allowances in the Bible, but hear the words of Jesus. Right? There is hope. Right, there's often a sense in which we want to look for the way out, and Jesus is saying, no, there are resources. There are real powerful resources in the gospel to find a gracious way through. And so really quick, if you're here this morning and you're single, I would encourage you to at least listen to this, take this to heart, and begin to let this color your vision of marriage. And then in the meantime, I would just say, make it be your prayer that you would choose very wisely. Right? Don't choose flippantly, but also be very prayerful that you would actually become the wise choice for someone else. To be the person who is a godly person, humble, teachable, correctable, selfless. Be the wise choice. Right, if you're married, fight for grace. Fight for grace. And if you're divorced, or maybe you're here and you're thinking, oh man, I don't know if I had biblical grounds. Well, hear me very clearly. The past is the past. Right? And you have not committed the unpardonable sin. Right? Remain as you are and realize God has not turned his back on you. He has not turned his back on you, right? He shed his own blood for you so that you could be forgiven. So Jesus is very clear, don't look for a way out, but look for a gracious way through. And then the second part of our text, what is he teaching us? He's teaching us about our words, and what does he want us to know? He wants us to say what we mean and mean what we say. Say what we mean and mean what we say. Don't worry, we'll go more quickly here. But Jesus, in these verses 33 through 37, he is after truthfulness. And so what is actually fully developed during Jesus' time was this entire legalistic system around oaths and swearing based upon Old Testament teaching that Jesus refers to in verse 33. If you look there, he says, you have heard that it was said to those of old, you shall not swear falsely, but shall perform to the Lord what you have sworn. And so, very interestingly, These people built up all these ways in which you could say certain things, make certain promises, but depending on how you said it, you either had to do it or you didn't have to do it. And so that's what Jesus is referring to in verses 34 and 35. So there is this Jewish code of law called the Mishnah, just for one example here. And there's this whole teaching around oaths. And in there's a rabbi who says, if you swear, make an oath by Jerusalem, you're not bound to fulfill your vow. If you just go, I swear by Jerusalem, it'd be the equivalent of like crossing your fingers behind your back, in our culture, which doesn't work. But you know what I mean, right? We're all like, I was crossing my fingers. When you're a kid, it works, I guess, okay? But he says, if you swear toward Jerusalem, you're bound by your vow. So basically, if you go, I swear by Jerusalem, you don't have to fulfill it. If you swear toward it, you did. Do you see how silly that is? Right? It was just a way in which they were trying to figure out, how do I say certain things, but I don't really mean it? Right? And how can I get out of things? This idea of oaths had just crumbled into these terrible rules, which you're just trying to get away with lying and deception, basically. His point is, no, say what you mean and mean what you say. Your words really matter. I know that you read the former section on divorce and we feel the weight of that. We go, this is pretty serious. I don't even know if I can take this in, which is why in Matthew 19, the disciples say, who should even get married? This is a difficult teaching, right? And Jesus is like, some people should be single, right? It's hard. Well, we get to this and we're like, it's just words, But Jesus isn't putting down like grades of seriousness here. Words really matter. Jesus is being very clear about that. And he's saying, you're making all these promises, not even intending to keep them, or you are, and you don't have any jurisdiction over these things. You don't have any jurisdiction to do anything over Jerusalem, the city of the great king, or earth. Earth doesn't belong to you. You can't even turn a hair color on your head from gray to black, which I would love that right now. I have a lot of, salt in my pepper over here, okay? So what does he do? He ends by saying anything more than this comes from evil, which makes sense, doesn't it? Satan's called the father of lies. He's a deceiver. So think about that. Does that kind of up the game on seriousness? If Satan's the deceiver, if he's the father of lies, and yet I'm just spitting out deceit, I'm like in line with that, right? It's pretty serious, I think. We talk a lot. It's estimated that we talk between 10,000 and 20,000 words per day. Right, that's like a 20 to 40 page paper, single-spaced. I'm probably going to speak about 5,000 words in this sermon alone. That's a lot of opportunities to say things I shouldn't say, to overpromise and underdeliver. Right? There's a lot of ways to screw up, and I think we've all experienced this. We've all said things that we didn't mean to say. We said things and we had no intention of following through on it. We said things and it really hurt people, didn't we? That's why I think a lot of us, if I were to ask you, hey, complete this sentence, if only I hadn't blank. If only I hadn't, what would you fill in the blank there? I would bet if we weren't even talking about words this morning, that most of us would naturally plug in the word said. If only I hadn't said. If only I hadn't said. We speak a lot of empty words, don't we? And Jesus gave us a powerful picture of this. He told us that a tree is known by its fruit. So if the fruit's rotten, the tree's rotten. If the tree's good, the fruit's good. And so later on in Matthew chapter 12, he says these words, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And then he says 2 verses later, on the day of judgment, people will give an account for every careless word they speak. He's getting at this idea that it's not just about the external modification and control of things. It's about your heart, isn't it? You don't have a vocabulary problem. You don't have a technique problem. We have a heart problem. We have never spoken a word in our lives, you guys, that is not ruled by our hearts. Jesus is making that very clear. And so I do think that there is a really good connection here to our marriage vows. Right? God joins 2 people together. We hold a ceremony for that. And the officiant will end by saying what God has joined together, let no man separate. The words of Jesus. And what seals that or demonstrates that covenant, that one flesh covenant, is when the husband and wife give their vows to each other. And I'll be honest with you, I've done many weddings now over the last 15 or so years, and I once made the mistake of letting people write their own vows. And since then, I've been like, I'm really sorry, if I'm gonna do your wedding, you need to do the traditional vows, or you at least need to include them with the vows you've written. And the reason is, and they're great, right? But I've seen so many people write like, I promise to rub your back every night and buy you flowers once a week and all these things. And I'm like, that's awesome, but like, you're not gonna do that, Like you're literally signing up to break your promise right now, But the vows, right? The rich vows that people have said for 600 years are what? I promise myself to you as long as we both shall live. For rich or for poor, whether we have all the things in the world or nothing, in sickness or in health, if we're like the healthiest people backpacking through Europe, or you're paralyzed tomorrow and I take care of you for the rest of your life. One of the spectrums is for better or worse. How general is that? Why do we say those things? Because marriage is a covenant. And so I'm saying to you, I promise these things to you for as long as we both shall live. Right? You're making these promises that, granted, are really hard to keep. And so we must live a life of faithfulness, of looking for a way through, of meaning what we say. And so I would say even beyond marriage, there's so many moments, you guys, day to day, where because of our fear of man, because we're over concerned about what other people think about us, we make promises that we don't even intend to keep. Someone will say, do you want to go to coffee? And you're like, sure. And you're going to text them later and say, I can't go, Maybe it's just me. Right, but we do this. I don't feel like doing it, so I'm not going to do it. And Jesus says, I know that is like the way everyone else around you lives. But that is not the way. I know that's how everyone else does it. But that's not the way of the kingdom. That's not the good life. The good life is a faithful life. The good life is a truthful life. And so I would bet this morning at this point, if you're anything like me, you might have some sense of, man, I have a faithfulness problem. How am I going to live this out? And so I just want to end by encouraging you with the gospel, honestly, and tell you this. For faithfulness fuel, if you want fuel for faithfulness in your life, I know only one well you can drink from. And that is, for faithfulness fuel, study Jesus. Just study Jesus. We all know the principle in life that you will drift towards what your eyes focus on, right? That's why when you're riding your bike, or you're driving in your car, and you look in your blind spot for too long, or you're on a trail riding your bike and you look behind you, right? You're always going to drift towards what your eyes are looking at. That's true physically. It's actually true spiritually. It's true in every way of your life. And so, what are two things then? One for each of those points, right? What are two things that you and I could take in, meditate on, right? Not just memorize, but actually take into our lives that'll help us fuel a life of faithfulness. The first one related to marriage is this. If you want to live a life of faithfulness in your marriage, focus on Jesus as the true and better husband of his bride, the church. Just take that in. Jesus is the faithful husband of his bride, the church. Which, if you're a Christian, that means he is very, very true and faithful to you. Like, he will never divorce you. He will never have enough of you. He will never say, you know what, I'm done with you. He'll never do that. And we have this amazing picture of this in the Bible. If you've never read it, go read the book of Hosea in the Old Testament. You have this prophet that God raises up named Hosea, and what does he do? He tells him, he commands him to go and marry Gomer, who's a prostitute, knowing that you're going to do that and that she is going to go and continually be unfaithful in her marriage with you again and again and again. And every single time, bring her back, take her back, be gracious to her, welcome her back. And why does he tell Hosea to do that? He said, so that my people would know what it's like to be me. God is this faithful husband of his bride who continually welcomes you and I back again and again. His mercies are new every single morning, aren't they? He's gracious towards you. His arms are open towards you every day. We were unfaithful again. Come on home. Get in here. Right, this is your God. This is your personal life experience if you're a Christian. It's to know and treasure the grace of God in your life. Oh man, I don't know any other fuel for marriage than that. Secondly, if you want to grow in your faithfulness in your words, meditate on the fact that Jesus is the one who is the great promise keeper. That all of the promises in the Bible are actually yes and true and found as being valid in Jesus. You will never experience Jesus as someone who will tell you something and later you found out he was exaggerating or he was bending the truth. He's never going to blow you off to save face or something, right? He's the faithful one. He promises things and he fulfills everything he promises and what he commands of us. He actually even lives it out. So he never says something and says, hey, do this, and he doesn't do it. He always lives it out himself. He means what he says, and he says what he means. He's never spoken a careless word in his life. This is your God. And don't you want his words to be valid and true? Like, I need to trust his words. I need to trust his truth because I don't always see that promise experienced in my day-and-day life. But I know it's true. I know it's true. Study him, you guys. Just like the way someone studies a photo of someone that they love and miss. You know what that's like? I mean, this week at camp, at the closing ceremony, I took a little video, like a short video of my little girl, Isla. She was doing all the dance moves and stuff like that to camp, and she was like killing it, you know? And I took a little video, just 20 seconds, because I was like, I'm not going to watch like 5 minutes. But at 20 seconds, and you want to know, I don't know how many times I've watched that video since Friday. I just keep watching it. And I watch it, and I just get so happy just watching her, like singing these words that are so precious for her to know, and doing all these dance moves and stuff. But I'm like studying the video. Not because I'm going to be quizzed on it later, not because I'm trying to learn the dance myself, because that would be embarrassing, right? I couldn't even do it. It's because I just love her, you know? Like this morning, I, as many of you know, I get here early when it's dark, just so I can walk the campus and pray every week. And I don't say that to be like, oh, I'm so righteous. No, it's because I like realize unless God does anything, then nothing eternal value is going to happen here. And so I pray. And it's usually in the dark, but this morning, because it's summer, it was glorious because I'm standing in this parking lot praying, looking out towards that mountain range, and the back of the mountains are being lit up. It's starting to be pink, and it's beautiful. The moon's even out still. And I'm just sitting there peacefully praying, but studying the sky. I'm not doing it so I can draw it later and know all the facts. Well, the moon was here and, whatever. Just taking it in. And in that moment, I'm noticing the clouds are moving so slowly. And you kind of have that thought. I don't know if you've ever had this thought. Man, those clouds are always moving, but I don't notice it until I'm standing still. Until I'm still and I'm focusing on it, I don't even notice that it's moving. I'm saying all this to say that's what I mean when I'm saying study Jesus. Like, take him in. He is this for you. And I'm telling you, that is the only thing that'll change your life. And I've seen him change so many people's lives. We need to baptize someone again today. God's changed his life. We baptized Alfred in the first service. God changed his life. And this last week, I had this amazing moment where I got to meet with a really close friend who's a pastor in the area, and he told me a story of a guy that he met with who God just recently changed his life. And I was like, I have to tell you this story today in closing. He met with this guy, who told him that when he was a little boy, his dad would take him to church and then take him to the car and beat him. So he hated God, he hated the church. At the age of 7, he had a moment where he felt so happy. He was with his dad and his brothers, and he ran up to his dad and he hugged his dad. And his dad shoved him to the ground and said, "Why would you ever do that?" And his brothers laughed at him. I'm telling my wife this story, just weeping my way through it. I can't imagine that being my story. And so he told my friend, at that moment I changed. And I knew, I can't ever really be honest about my emotions or anything like that. So for the rest of his life, he started doing meth at the age of 11, heroin at 17. Life continued on. Later on in life, he got California clean, I think some people say. Still wasn't great. Married a lady. They were married for 15 years. Not a great husband. And she would go to her small group in my friend's church and to say, "Pray for my husband, pray for my husband, pray for my husband, pray for my husband, pray for my husband." And then like a month or two ago, he was being a terrible husband one day, and he was filled with so much self-hatred, He's like yelling or whatever, and his wife, once again, I guess she'd said it so many times, looked at him in the face and said, "I love you, I forgive you, and I'm not giving up." And he said in that exact moment, that was the second moment in his life where his life changed, because God broke him. He said, in that moment, when I was looking at my wife's face, I felt like I saw the face of God. Because he said to her in anger and surprise and confusion, "How could you ever love somebody like me? Why would you ever forgive someone like me? That's so stupid." And she just said, "Well, that's what God's love is like. That's what God's forgiveness is like." And it was that kind of kindness and grace that actually changed his life. Like it literally did. Like he's a different person and he's beginning to change. And he's not going to be perfect. But it was through her heart that said, I'm not looking for a way out, I'm looking for a way through. I'm looking for a way through. That God worked through that in his life. Guys, I'm not saying every result of our faithfulness will be those types of experiences, but you need to know that when you are faithful, God smiles on you. And he says these words, right, that we've been listening to this whole summer. "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are you when you mourn, for you will be comforted. Blessed are the pure in heart, for you will be the one who sees God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called children of God." It's so nice to read the Beatitudes, isn't it? Oh, that sounds nice. It's hard to live out. But with God's help, we can. And you will experience that smile. Let's pray.